Back to earth, and in London, poverty is real enough. Michael Naranjo has been investigating.
Hi, my name is Michael Naranjo, reporting for worldwrite, and today we're outside Poplar Job Centre Plus. I'm here with Michael and Aaron, and we're going to talk about job seekers' allowance and how much they earn. How much do you earn, Michael, per fortnight?
Well, you get £47.85 a week, but obviously it's not enough to live on.
I applied for a price slip 2 days ago. I said my electric went, my food went off. I still ain't got money to pay. I still don't. Because I ain't got proof my electric went. I mean, how can I get proof? I can bring my key down, or I can take off the meter and give them the meter if they want that.
Do you have enough for the bills?
Of course no, because we're always struggling with the payment. When the bills time is coming, we just think, oh, what we're gonna do, what we're gonna do. And plus the payment, which is minimum wage, is not going to be good enough, because you're receiving less money and you're paying tax more, and the rent is expensive, the travel is expensive, the food, shopping, everything is expensive.
I live in Canary Wharf, and there is actually a big divide between people who have money and people who don't have so much money. It's just an ongoing upward struggle just to maintain survival.
And how would you change things if you had power?
If I had power?
Not superhuman power, but if you were in the government.
You know, I'll issue them more money.
More money.
More money for everyone, that's what I'd say.
Thank you, Michael. In the studio, we have journalist and economist Daniel Ben-Ami, who's presenting a report on poverty and inequality in London. And to discuss his report is volunteer Jo van der Voort. Over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Ruji. People often assume that poverty and inequality are confined to the third world nowadays, but that's a mistake. Although it's true that poverty is more extreme in developing countries, it still exists right here in London. There are loads of people struggling to get by. Official statistics tell part of the story. There are about 500,000 low-paid people in London, defined as those earning less than £7 an hour, and about 130,000 people claiming unemployment benefits. A lot about the low paid in London won't surprise you. They're predominantly either young, female, part-time, from ethnic minorities or disabled. Often they're a combination of several of these elements. They're concentrated in such sectors as hotels, restaurants and retail. Perhaps more surprising is that more of them live in outer London than inner London. Croydon, Bromley and Barnet have the highest numbers of low paid, along with Newham. The leafy suburbs are not always as comfortable as they seem. But no doubt, such statistics only tell part of the story. Many people struggle to get by, even if they earn more than £7 an hour. London's an expensive place to live. They might work long hours, or get into debt, or simply get by on a low income. Even those with a house and a mortgage are far from guaranteed a decent standard of living. Others simply don't show up in the official statistics. They might not have a job, but for one reason or another, they're not officially registered as unemployed. Or they might be migrant workers, forced to work illegally as a result of immigration controls. The solution to the problem of London's poverty is to have more economic growth and more prosperity. We should reject the idea of having more social controls and more policing to counter the effects of poverty. Instead, the battle should be to increase affluence so everyone can enjoy the good life.
Thanks, Daniel. That was very interesting. Could you tell us more about those social controls that you mentioned and the effect that they're having on the situation in London?
Well, I think those people in power recognise this inequality. I mean, it's right in front of their faces, so they recognise it. But rather than say, let's make the poor richer, let's have more growth, they say, oh my God, there's all these poor people. What we need to do is to control antisocial behaviour, to have more policing. At best, it's irrelevant, but in fact, it's actually leading to problems of there's more social control, more regulation of people's lives.
Okay. So would you say that economic growth is simply the answer to reducing inequalities, or would that aggravate the problem in a way? And would the inequalities disappear when economic growth took place?
Well, I think economic growth is necessary to make people's lives better, to make people better off. It doesn't automatically mean that inequality disappears, because you can have the rich getting richer and the poor getting richer as well. But the key thing is that the poor people get better off and get more affluent. For me, that's what we should be aiming for, to make poverty disappear, because the poor people are richer and they get everything that they need to play a full role in society.
So what would you say are the root causes of income inequality and poverty in London?
I'd say a few things, but I'd say a key thing is not enough growth is being generated. There's a certain amount of growth being generated. You can see the City of London does pretty well. but not enough is generated to make sure that the lowest section of society has a high enough income to have a decent standard of living.
A lot of people would argue that what you're saying goes against their kind of views that consumption is a bad thing. Do those views have a valuable contribution to make to the situation, would you say?
I don't think so. I think often the people who say that often mean their consumption is okay. You know, rich people often assume, well, their consumption is okay, but when poor people consume, that's a bit horrible and distasteful. Whereas I would say raising the levels of income and the levels of consumption of ordinary people is a good thing. I mean, what does it mean? It means they can have more mobile phones, cars, a higher standard of living. That means, in economic terms, that means more consumption, which I think is something we should welcome.
So what do you think lies behind these anti-consumption and pro-environment views that hamper development in your view?
I think there's a kind of elitism. People saying, well, it's okay if we, decent, respectable middle-class people consume, but we don't want the majority of people to consume. And there's a pessimism about economic growth. People are just very gloomy about the prospects for growth. So I think those are two key elements of the whole thing.
Just to go back to your earlier point about the growth of the city, a lot of people would see people earning millions in the big financial centres, whilst the people who serve them their coffees, for instance, are struggling by a minimum wage. And they would argue that income redistribution would be the answer to the problem. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's interesting. I think what people often mean when they talk about redistribution is equality of sacrifice. I mean, everyone should make sacrifices, everyone should make do with less. Whereas I would say what we need is to have ordinary people having more, you know, the people serving coffee being paid a lot more. It's not a question of taking a little bit of money away from the rich and giving it to the poor. It's a question of making the cake bigger overall so that everyone can be better off. Not too bothered about a few people earning £1 million, as long as the majority of people can get better off and benefit from economic growth.
Given that there's a big slowdown, a lot of coverage in the media over the current economic credit crunch problems, is there anything else that we can do if we can't rely on economic growth to reduce inequality and provide for London's poor?
Well, in a way, economic growth is a bottom line kind of issue. I mean, if there's not economic growth, it's hard to see people getting better off. So a key thing is to work out how you can start generating economic growth rather than having an economic slowdown. And I think probably the first thing to do of all is to raise people's expectations. So people can see that it is possible if they strive to be better off, if society as a whole can become better off, then they can benefit from that. Rather than have everyone just trying to restrain themselves and, you know, switch the light off when they're not using it, put their TV on standby, just spending hours and hours and hours just trying to minimise their consumption. Much better would be trying to work out how we as a society can become richer and better off. There was a financial bubble which has burst, although I'd say at the same time the current economic problems shouldn't be exaggerated. I mean, there's an economic slowdown, but it's nothing like the Great Depression of the 1930s or something like that. But if we're asking how can we get out of this problem, I'd see it first of all as a question of raising people's horizons and working out how to generate growth. People are not going to be better off without economic growth. That's really the bottom line. If you don't have a bigger pie, then people can't have more resources.
Thanks, Daniel. That was really interesting. Back to you in the studio, Ruji.
Thank you, Joe and Daniel.